It's not over till you say it's over. Today, let's talk about ending encounters in Pathfinder 2nd Edition on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I'm the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I'm a storyteller who is not bitter at all that you managed to triple crit the final boss and kill him in the second round of combat. No, not bitter at all. I didn't spend hours working on that fight. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we're continuing my storytelling in Pathfinder 2nd Edition series, and we're going to be taking a look at ending encounters. Now, in this series, we've been looking at the different modes of play for Pathfinder 2nd Edition: encounter mode, exploration mode, and downtime mode. Right now, we're working through some of the issues surrounding encounter mode, and we've looked at building encounters and pacing encounters, so that leads very naturally to the subject of ending encounters. How do we end encounters, and how do we do it in a way that lends itself well to the story that we are creating at our tables? So the content for today is primarily being drawn from the Pathfinder 2nd Edition core rulebook and the game mastery section that's found in there. We're going to be looking at ending encounters and also a little bit on the subject of bypassing encounters, which can be found on pages 493 and 494 of the core rulebook. Now, this series is intended to be for storytellers of all skill levels, from beginner to veteran, and even if Pathfinder 2nd Edition is not necessarily your main game, I still invite you to be a part of this conversation. I have found as a storyteller that it is a good practice to study many different games, because in studying other games you can often learn unique perspectives or useful tricks that you can bring back to your home game. So, let's get started. Or, should I say, let's get this over with. In a way, ending encounters is a pretty simple process. But we do want to pause and consider this portion of storytelling because it does influence how that story is received. The battle lines have been drawn, the participants have committed themselves to the action, the advantage has shifted from one side to another, mistakes have been made, opportunities have been taken, and the time has come for one side to emerge victorious. Or, well, at least that's the way we hope it goes, but in reality, there are a number of different ways that an encounter can end. Encounters can end with your party's successful, having defeated their enemies and looting everything that isn't nailed down, and maybe a few things that are. But encounters can also end on the other extreme with the dreaded total party kill or TPK. And sometimes there's this middle ground where your players and their enemies kind of reach a standoff where neither side is capable of achieving victory and there's a stalemate between the two. The reality is there are multiple different ways for an encounter to come to a conclusion, and as a storyteller, you want to be mindful of this reality because it opens up so many different possible storytelling beats. Now, paradoxically, the first way that an encounter can end is before it even begins, so let's talk a little bit about bypassing encounters. Sometimes your party, for one reason or another, will successfully bypass an entire encounter. They will completely skip that particular scene, that particular fight, or that particular challenge. Sometimes it's because your players came up with a particularly clever ruse, or used some crazy scheme, or the dice just rolled really well in their favor. And other times, let's be honest, your players are going to skip encounters because of pure dumb luck. But sometimes you will plan for your players to face a particular challenge, and because of the choices that they make and the way that the dice land, that encounter just isn't happening. And this is where we need to ask the question, what should you do as a storyteller? Now, let me just start off by saying this is a good point to practice the art of flexibility in storytelling. If your players successfully bypass an encounter, you know what? That's actually kind of a good thing. They're conserving resources. They are in better shape for whatever encounter might be coming next down the line. And it can even be fun sometimes as a storyteller to let the party know about particular things that they narrowly missed or managed to dodge. I've had more than a few occasions where my players have been like, oh, so glad we missed that one. So bypassing encounters can be a good thing, and I just want to encourage you first and foremost as a storyteller to be flexible, be willing to adapt your story when those kinds of things happen. It's okay. Now, one question that will commonly arise when it comes to bypassing encounters is, what about the experience and treasure rewards that might have come from that particular encounter? And generally speaking, my rule is this. If your players actively did something that allowed them to bypass the encounter, I'm going to go ahead and give them the experience, and I'm probably going to work most of, if not all of that treasure that they would have received into the future of the adventure somehow. I planned for them to get that experience, I planned for them to get that treasure, and if they actively did something to overcome that encounter or bypass that encounter, then I'm going to reward them. However, there are situations where players dodge encounters entirely by dumb luck. And in those situations, I'm typically not going to give out the XP or treasure because, well, the players didn't do anything to warrant that XP or treasure. And to give you a couple of examples of what this might look like, if the players need to get past some guards and they employ some cunning disguises or create a distraction out in the town that lures the guards away, sure, they didn't fight the guards, but I'm still going to give them the XP or treasure that might have been rewarded for that particular encounter. On the flip side, sometimes players just do crazy things and miss encounters by dumb luck. Several years ago, I was running a campaign, and my players were being tracked by some interplanar bounty hunters. Yeah, that's probably the best way to describe that scenario. And my players came to the realization that one of their enemies was going to be in a particular location at a particular time, and they didn't have much time to get there. They had to rush if they wanted to catch their enemy. But it's okay, the party had an airship. It would be no problem at all for them to hop on board their airship and fly over to where they knew their enemy was going to be. Of course, waiting for them at said airship was the interplanar bounty hunters that were looking for them. I planned for the party to have to fight off these bounty hunters so that they could get on their airship and then fly to take down the enemy. My players instead just burned several very high-level spell slots to put some overland flight spells on themselves and just carry themselves to the encounter, not bothering to use their airship at all. My players had no idea that the bounty hunters were there. They had no idea that that encounter was coming, and they completely skipped it. I know I may sound a little emotional in the last couple of minutes, but I think every game master ever understands the frustration of that story. In that particular story, my players didn't do anything to actively bypass the encounter. They avoided it entirely out of dumb luck, so the XP and treasure for that encounter were not handed out. But as a fairly safe general rule, if your players do something to actively bypass an encounter, you should find a way to work that XP and treasure into the rewards that you give them, because even if they didn't have the fight scene, they still overcame that challenge. Now, there are a couple of other small issues that come with bypassing encounters, and let's go ahead and talk about those. One of them is the, well, fundamental disappointment that you feel as a game master when an encounter that you spent time designing doesn't get used. Well, here's a fun little secret of storytelling. You can always reuse it. In the case of the story I just shared, those bounty hunters did show back up at a later date, and my party did have to overcome that challenge. I moved that encounter from the original location at their airship to another location further down in the storyline. So it's perfectly okay as a game master if you spend some time designing a really cool encounter and your party manages to skip it, and particularly if they manage to skip it and don't even realize that they skipped it, reuse the thing. Move it somewhere else, throw it in the story somewhere down the line, have fun. This can be particularly important when we talk about the second issue that can come up on bypassing encounters, which is when your players bypass a critical encounter. Maybe in that encounter, your players were supposed to learn a particularly important piece of information, gain a particularly important clue, or find an item that it was going to be necessary for later on in the story. What do you do when your players just casually stroll past something very important that they're going to need? Well, this is where reusing encounters becomes particularly important. Maybe the villains that they were fighting finish up their task in location number 1 and work their way to a future location where you know your party will end up. You can often logically advance your story in some way where the clue or item or information that the party needs that was originally here moves over here, and typically your players will be none the wiser. Now I will say this, don't just reuse encounters because you want to punish your players. Random Bandit Group number 4 is not that important to your overall storyline, but if it's a particularly cool encounter or if it's a particularly important encounter and your party somehow finds a way to bypass it, you can often find a way to work it into your story later so that that particular story beat still takes place. But let's imagine that your party actually makes it to the encounter and now it's time to finish that encounter. Let's move on to ending encounters. So when we talk about ending encounters, usually we think of it as one of two options. The party wins or the villains win. But I think it's more of a scale. On one extreme, you have the party completely annihilating whatever group of enemies that they face, and on the other extreme end of the scale, you have the party TPK. But there are actually several points between those two that can happen at the end of an encounter. So I want to talk about 7 possible endings on a scale from completely killing your enemies to the party TPK. There is, of course, the typical, the party just takes out everyone they're fighting. But then there's also the party capturing their opponents. The next step that you might want to consider is your party routing the enemies and their enemies fleeing from the battlefield. In the middle, we have the one I referenced earlier, which is the standoff between two sides where neither has a clear advantage. Moving to some of the worst outcomes for your players, you have the party that is losing the battle and they are forced to flee the battlefield. You also have a battle that goes very badly for the party and one or more of the party members is either captured or killed. And then, of course, the ultimate extreme, the party TPK. Each of these represents a possible resolution to the encounter that you are running, and as a storyteller, you want to be mindful of these different possibilities. And let me just go ahead and say, you want to know which possibilities are acceptable for your story. Okay, before we dig into the specific possible endings here, let me just say this. If a party TPK is something you know you don't want, if you know it's going to ruin the game, if you know it's just going to make everyone upset, if you know you as a storyteller don't want it to happen, then party TPK needs to be off the board before the game begins. And the reason that I say this is, I have seen a lot of storytellers who swear that they will never fudge a dice roll and swear that they will never change the outcome of an encounter, but when a player death or a party TPK is imminent, they start fudging. And it's obvious. You as a game master need to decide when you are running encounters, are you okay with particular outcomes? And you need to decide that before the first dice is ever rolled. As a storyteller, it is important to decide which storytelling beats you are okay with, which outcomes you are okay with, and make sure that you are doing the prep work ahead of time so that whichever way the story goes, you're ready to play out that encounter. Now, one side of the scale that I presented is very much the party wins side of the scale. They kill their opponents, they capture their opponents, or maybe they drive their opponents from the battlefield. Regardless of which one you pick, the overall theme of that outcome is the party wins. Now, obviously, the simplest one for you as a storyteller is the party just kills whatever monsters that they're fighting. It's clean, it's simple, you don't have to think a lot about the implications of that encounter as it might apply to the rest of the story. The enemy is dead. And the reality is, as a storyteller, this is the ending you're probably going to use the most often because it is so simple. You don't have to think about the future implications. Where do those enemies go? What happened to those enemies? What do the players need to do in response? Wiping out the villains is a clean way of wrapping up that particular encounter. Other outcomes introduce complexity to the story, and so sometimes, in fact, many times, you would probably prefer that very simple conclusion. But do not underestimate the power of the story beats that come from the other two options here: capturing enemies or driving your enemies from the battlefield. In most situations, your party is going to be dealing with intelligent opponents. And the reality is, most people, even most creatures, have a desire to live, and if they are afraid for their life, they are likely to take steps to preserve it. If the villains can't beat your players, there's a real possibility that they might do something like surrender or flee the battlefield in an attempt to preserve their life. Even in animals, we see a survival instinct. If an animal believes that it is outmatched, it will flee. And so, if your villain is a thinking opponent in any capacity, it kind of hurts the story a little bit if they are committed to a battle to the death for no reason whatsoever. Sure, there are going to be some villains that are so evil, so maniacal, that the only possible outcome is kill or be killed, but for a lot of opponents, there's a real possibility that they might be willing to lay down their arms, and you as a storyteller need to be mindful of that, and think through what you want to happen if that occurs. Now, one of the cool things about capturing the enemies is it provides for a very interesting story moment and some interesting role-playing options for your players. An enemy that surrenders may be able to offer critical intel for a more powerful member of whatever organization the party is up against. Secret entrances to the lair, when and where the BBEG sleeps, a list of people who might flip on the villain. There's all kinds of useful information the party can gain from interrogating enemies that they capture. However, it's kind of important to note that capturing enemies works best in an urban setting, or at least some kind of setting where the party can quickly turn whoever they have captured over to other NPCs. Capturing enemies in the middle of the wilderness or deep in the caves or other things like that results in a situation where the party has to expend resources to try and contain and control the people that they've captured. People cunning enough to flip on their master when they realize that they're losing the battle might also be cunning enough to attack the party when their back is turned. And while the tension of that scenario can be very interesting, the practicality in play is often tedious and just kind of slows things down. So usually I find that scenarios where your players can capture the enemies are best left to occasions where you can then turn the enemies over to the city watch or to some other authoritative figure that can then carry them off, and the party doesn't have to deal with the minutiae of managing whoever it is that they now have in custody. The other option here is the fleeing enemy. The enemy who realizes that he's overmatched and flees the battlefield, heads off into the night, and gives up his life of villainy for the safety of not having to deal with player characters ever again. And this is really useful in situations where you don't want to have to deal with the what happens next of the story. If the party is clearly winning against the bandits and two of those bandits take off and ditch their allies, you don't really have to think too hard about where those two nameless bandits went or how they might fit into the future of your story. So fleeing enemies can serve as a nice variant whenever your party is maybe away from a city or a town or something like that, but it's not just limited to those occasions. Sometimes enemies might choose to flee if they know that they can make it to other allies. Sure, they may be losing this battle, but they may be able to find some of their allies, regroup, and rejoin the fight. Particularly in urban encounters, the enemies that your players face might be close to other allies that they could seek out in an effort to regain the advantage. So, as a storyteller, you want to keep the possibility of fleeing enemies in mind. Now, the core rulebook does bring up the question, what should you do if players want to chase fleeing enemies? And this is one of those things where I suggest simplifying the dice rolls or the rules for that particular encounter. In an urban encounter, you might use something like acrobatics or athletics to determine how quickly that your party is moving versus the person that they're chasing. And if you want to go that route, Pathfinder 2nd Edition even has things like chase cards that you can use to kind of fill in that gap. You can obviously pull out chase rules for wilderness encounters as well, but wilderness encounters also open up the possibility of your players chasing their enemies by tracking them with skills like survival. You want to keep an open mind as a storyteller because you definitely have some options about how your party can choose to chase a fleeing enemy. Now, of course, on the opposite side of the scale, you have the outcomes that represent the party losing the particular encounter, where the party flees the battlefield, where the party loses one of their members to a capture or a kill, or the dreaded total party kill outcome. Now, as I established in the previous section, intelligent creatures understand that a fight to the death is not always completely necessary, and their competing priorities might cause them to decide to surrender or flee the battlefield or otherwise take steps to preserve their life if it seems like the battle is going against them. But we're dealing with player characters here, so yeah, I think the total party kill is the only one I get to talk about. Okay, so let's go ahead and put this one right out in the open. Players have a bad habit of biting off more than they can chew and not wanting to let go of that decision. A few particularly bad dice rolls, a failed save at the wrong moment, a surprise from the villain that your party didn't anticipate, and all of a sudden, your players can find themselves on their back foot, reeling on the verge of collapse, and in those moments, your players quite often are going to sink their heels in and do everything that they can to keep fighting, no matter how obvious it is that running is the right answer here. And one of the things you want to think about as a storyteller when you see these situations starting to unfold is how you can communicate narratively to your players that they might want to think outside the normal box and stop clicking the attack button because the time has come to retreat, regroup, and come up with a new plan. The threat of loss does need to be real, otherwise your players are not going to be invested in what is happening. But as a storyteller, you may need to think of ways to help your players realize that there are more options than just fighting the losing battle. For example, if you see your party losing a fight, mention that as their body begins to shake and as they begin to feel the effects of fear, that they glance across the room and notice an open window that they could climb out of if they wanted to escape. Giving your players options other than just keep swinging might be the mental clue that your party needs to avoid that dreaded TPK. If your players flee, it is usually worthwhile to give them at least a little bit of breathing room before sending someone in their pursuit. Theoretically, in the course of their fight, they injured some of their opponents, maybe dropped one or two of the minions, and in those situations, it is logical that their enemies would probably tend to their wounds before setting off in hot pursuit. You don't necessarily want to let players get off scot-free, but if the combat was overwhelming, giving them a few moments to rest, maybe make some medicine rolls, and most importantly, giving them a moment to plan where they want to go next or what they want to do next, it's just a healthy thing to give your players. They are probably very frustrated, likely due to some very bad dice rolls, and giving them that moment to breathe and recover emotionally before continuing with whatever the next step of the story would be is usually going to be a good idea. Also bear in mind that if your party is losing, that the villains that you are running for that encounter might be willing to capture your party members rather than outright killing them. Just like the player characters can interrogate the bandits that they captured, the villain can interrogate your players. It can lead to interesting storytelling moments, and then you get to run a fun prison break scene as well. Keep your villain's motivations in mind, and realize that outright killing a character is not necessarily the first thing that a villain is going to go for in every scenario. In fact, if the villains are winning, you can have a villain waste one of his actions on his turn to offer the player characters a chance to surrender. It creates an interesting storytelling moment and gives your players a chance to surrender or flee, or maybe they want to continue fighting, but at least your enemy had one less attack before they did so. Just keep in mind that when the enemies win, you don't always have to resort to player character death. Sometimes there are other options that might make for an interesting story moment. However, we do have to discuss character death. And let's just be honest, it's never fun. A player that loses a character, they are probably going to want to step away from the table for a few minutes. They're probably going to need to kind of let the emotion of that moment settle if they lose a character that they are particularly attached to. And as a storyteller, you want to be sympathetic to the fact that it stinks. The player has lost in the most dramatic fashion. One of the things I really like that Matthew Mercer does on Critical Role is he offers characters a chance to utter their last words before they pass. Small things like that may give your player a little bit better of a sense of closure and also lead to some fun storytelling moments as well. But I do think as a storyteller you should be considerate when handling these emotions because it can be very frustrating, and just be respectful of your players if you get here. Now, the worst possible outcome is the total party kill, and I could probably do a whole video just on this subject. For now, probably the best piece of advice I can offer is you're going to want to debrief with your group after an event like this happens. Take a break, go get something to eat, maybe find something to do so that your group has a chance to just process the emotions if a TPK actually happens. After you've had some time, you want to come back together as a group and decide what's next. Now, maybe your group has invested a lot of time and a lot of energy into the story, and you would really hate for a TPK to be the end of that story. In such an instance, you may want to talk to your players about what you can do as a group to continue that story. Maybe their characters are dead, but they roll up new characters who are following in the footsteps of their previous characters, or other people in the game world that were somehow inspired by their characters. Or maybe the villain wins that particular story, and then you roll up characters who have to make their way through the world after the villain has achieved his goals. A total party kill is a really serious story moment, but it doesn't have to be the end of the story. But there's also a chance that it might need to be the end of the story, that your players don't want to pick that story back up, or they're too frustrated with the outcome of the story, and that the healthiest thing for the group might be just moving on to a new story and leaving that story behind. The important thing here is, as a game master, don't make that decision alone. Talk to your group, involve them in the conversation, and make that decision together about whether you want to continue the story in some fashion, or whether it's time to begin a new story with new characters. Handling character death, handling a total party kill, they're not easy to do. But if you are sympathetic, if you are compassionate, and if you're willing to talk to your players and really discuss what has happened as a group, it can still lead to good storytelling, and it can still lead to positive moments for your gaming table. But I do feel as a storyteller that character death and the total party kill are outcomes that you probably don't want to see at your gaming table. Or at least I hope as a game master you're not actively plotting to kill your PCs or to wipe out your party. Adversarial mindsets between players and storytellers is something I don't particularly enjoy. I see this hobby as a form of collaborative storytelling. I want real risk for my players, but at the end of the day, I want them to have a sense of accomplishment and success as well. So for me, avoiding those particularly dramatic outcomes is something that is desirable. And that's where the middle ground of my particular scale kind of comes into focus. The standoff. If you see that the dice are going badly for your players, one of the things that you can do as a storyteller is work towards a standoff rather than a character kill or a total party kill. Maybe one of the players is about to drop. Maybe one of the players goes unconscious. And your cunning villains seize the opportunity to grab that player, hold a knife to their throat, and start making demands. We'll let you live if you give us X, or leave us alone and we promise to go away. The enemies can continue to progress whatever their storyline might be, and your players get a chance to walk away, regroup, heal, recover, and decide how they would like to proceed from that point. Now, obviously this strategy doesn't apply to things like boss battles and the final confrontation with the BBEG of your campaign. But in a lot of fights, if you see things going south for your players, the standoff can be a middle ground that you can offer to your players that can prevent them from just fighting to the death and by extension running your campaign into the ground. It can be very motivating. It serves as a fun story beat while still allowing the story to progress in a logical fashion. So, as a game master, if you see the scale tipping a little too far in favor of the villains in the encounter, ask yourself if there's a way you can work a standoff into the encounter to give your party a readily available out so that the story can continue to develop. Now, as you can tell, when it comes to ending encounters, if you're going for anything other than kill all the enemies, it does require some flexibility as a storyteller, and that's why I spoke about flexibility at the start of this video. Diversifying the possible outcomes can make a story a lot more interesting, but it does mean as a storyteller you have to be prepared to react to a lot more situations and a lot more possible outcomes. And so that's why I say as a storyteller it is good before the encounter ever begins to ask, what are the possible outcomes for this encounter, and which possible outcomes am I comfortable with for this encounter? But it's time to turn the conversation over to you. What are your thoughts on bypassing encounters and ending encounters in an RPG? Are there any points on my possible ending scale that I left out that you think should be included in the list? Are there variations on encounter endings that I didn't discuss that storytellers should consider? Leave your thoughts in the comments section down below. Also, if you enjoyed this video, like it and share it, subscribe to the channel for more conversations about TTRPGs. If you're interested in my Discord or my Patreon, you can find links to those in the video description. Thank you so much for being part of the conversation, and have a wonderful day.